All right, let's jump right in. We're talking about one of the most epic showdowns in the entire Bible, Elijah on Mount Carmel. It's fantastic. But here's the thing. Before we even get to the fireworks, the author spends a ton of time just on the intro. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into why this super long prelude isn't just a warm-up. It's actually a masterclass in storytelling that sets the whole thing up perfectly. So right off the bat, here's the mystery we're trying to solve. The big event, the main showdown, it takes up about 25 verses. But the setup, the part before the battle, that gets 19 whole verses. I mean, in literary terms, that is a huge amount of real estate for an introduction. So you have to ask yourself, what is the author trying to drill into our heads before the story even gets going? And to crack this, we're going to use a little tool from literary analysis called the law of proportion. It's a really simple idea, but it's super powerful. The more space an author gives to something, the more important it is. So if the author's giving the prelude almost as much screen time as the climax, well, that tells you that the info packed into these first 19 verses is absolutely critical. This isn't filler, folks. This is the foundation for everything. All right, so let's start digging. The author is doing way more than just killing time here. They are meticulously, almost painfully, laying out the situation on the ground. They're basically handing us a set of clues that we're going to need to unlock the real meaning of the conflict that's about to erupt. You know, think of it like the first 10 minutes of a great thriller movie. Every little detail matters, right? We're getting a feel for the stakes, for the sheer desperation, and for the people involved. The author is deliberately slowing everything down so that when the action finally kicks off, we get exactly what's at risk and why it matters so much. Now, our first big clue comes from understanding the main character, Elijah. But to really get him, you have to understand what it meant to be a prophet in this world, because I guarantee you, it's probably not what you're thinking. And this chart really lays it out. In a lot of the ancient world, a prophet was basically just a puppet, a mouthpiece. The idea was that some god would literally seize them, wipe out their personality, and just talk through them. But that is not what's happening in the Bible. A biblical prophet is a partner with God. It's a dialogue. God doesn't erase them, he fills them. And he actually uses their unique personality to get his message across. Elijah is still Elijah. Oh, and I love this quote from Dr. John Oswalt. It just perfectly illustrates the point with this fantastic analogy. He says God isn't looking for a bunch of identical, perfect vessels. He wants to use your specific, one-of-a-kind shape, whether you see yourself as a fancy, polished goblet or, as he says, an ugly mug. The point is, God works through real, individual personalities. And that is so important for understanding why Elijah does what he does. He's not some robot. He's a partner in the plan. Okay, moving on to our second clue. This whole story doesn't happen in a vacuum. The author takes a lot of time to paint this really grim picture of a nation that has been pushed right to the very edge of survival. 3 years. For 3 years, there has been zero rain, not a single drop. I mean, can you even imagine the slow, grinding horror of a drought that lasts that long? This one number tells you everything you need to know about the scale of this crisis. This isn't just a dry spell. It is a full-blown catastrophe. And just look at the fallout. I mean, things are so bad that the king himself, Ahab, and his prime minister are out walking the countryside, personally searching for a few blades of grass. The cattle, the source of their food and wealth, they're already dead. And now they're worried about the horses and mules, what the text calls the battle instruments. We're talking about the engines of their army. Without them, the nation is totally defenseless. This isn't just an economic problem anymore. It's a massive national security emergency. So just when it feels like the story is completely filled with desperation and corruption, the author throws in a curveball. Our third clue. It's an unexpected character who shows us that even in the absolute worst of times, faith can still be alive. And his name is Obadiah. Now get this. This guy isn't just some random official. He is the prime minister, the man running the king's entire household. And while he's working right there in the heart of this corrupt government, he's been secretly risking his own neck. The wicked queen Jezebel was hunting down God's prophets to kill them, and Obadiah took 100 of them, hid them in caves, and kept them fed and alive. He is living proof that true faithfulness isn't totally dead in Israel. Okay, so let's recap. We have a prophet who is a true partner with God, a nation that's completely falling apart, and a secret believer in the highest levels of government. Now, the author brilliantly weaves these threads together in a conversation between Elijah and Obadiah that reveals the central theme of the entire story. So when Elijah tells Obadiah, hey, go tell King Ahab I'm here, Obadiah is terrified, but not for the reason you'd think. He isn't worried that Elijah is going to get scared and run off. He's afraid of something else entirely. So, what was it? What was he so worried about? And here it is. This is the absolute key to the whole setup. Obadiah basically says, the second I turn my back, the Spirit of the Lord might just snatch you up and teleport you somewhere else. He gets it. He knows Elijah serves a God who can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. It's this incredible insight into Obadiah's deep understanding of God's nature. And this brings us to the core tension of the story, this paradox. God is absolutely consistent in his character. He will always be good. He will always do what's right. But he is never predictable in his methods. We want a God we can put in a box, who does the same thing the same way every time, but that's just not who he is. Like Dr. Oswalt says, if you put God in a box, you're just going to end up with a broken box. Obadiah understood this deeply. So now it all clicks into place. Those 19 verses weren't just a long warm-up act. No way. They were a carefully built argument. The author showed us what a true prophet is, the sheer desperation of the people, the flicker of hidden faith, and this wild, consistent, but unpredictable nature of God. All of it was designed to funnel the reader towards a single, massive, story-defining question. Who is God? That's it. That's the question the whole story is about to answer on that mountain. Is it the God who has let the nation starve? Or is it the God who is always good but never predictable? The one who works through faithful people even in the darkest places imaginable? The stage is now set. The battle is about to begin. And now we know exactly what's at stake.